Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a bustling city square, surrounded by thousands of people, each clutching their glowing screens like sacred talismans. The air hums with the electric buzz of information. News alerts, social media notifications, endless streams of content flowing through invisible networks. Everyone appears connected, informed, enlightened. Yet as you look closer, really look, you notice something deeply unsettling. The woman to your left is sharing an article about climate change she hasn't read, spreading statistics she doesn't understand to followers who won't fact-check them. The man beside her is arguing passionately about economic policy based on a headline he glimpsed 3 seconds ago. Behind them, a teenager is forming political opinions from a 15-second video clip, while an elderly gentleman is making health decisions based on a conspiracy theory his nephew shared on Facebook. Here's the paradox that should terrify you. We live in the most information-rich era in human history, yet we're drowning in a sea of ignorance, so profound that previous generations, who had access to a fraction of our knowledge, seem like philosophical giants in comparison. How is it possible that the same technology, designed to democratize wisdom, has instead weaponized stupidity? You see, we've confused having access to information with actually being informed. We've mistaken the ability to Google anything with genuine understanding. We've traded the slow, methodical cultivation of wisdom for the instant gratification of opinion formation. And in doing so, we've created something far more dangerous than simple ignorance. We've created confident ignorance, the kind that spreads like wildfire and burns down centuries of hard-won human insight. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This isn't just about other people. This is about you. This is about me. This is about how our own minds have been hijacked by forces so subtle, so pervasive, that we don't even realize we're participating in our own intellectual destruction. Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important, not your preference for coffee or your favorite TV show, but something fundamental about how the world works, about human nature, about what matters in life. Can you remember? Or have you found yourself increasingly certain about increasingly complex issues, armed with fragments of information that feel complete, surrounded by echoing voices that confirm what you already believe? The ancient Greeks had a word, Sophia, meaning not just knowledge, but wisdom. The ability to discern truth from falsehood, to see beyond the surface of things, to understand the deeper patterns that govern human existence. Socrates, perhaps the wisest among them, claimed his only knowledge was that he knew nothing. Today we live in a world where everyone knows everything and no one knows anything. We've created a civilization of instant experts, where complex philosophical questions that occupied the greatest minds for millennia can now be solved with a quick internet search and a confident social media post. We've built echo chambers, so sophisticated that they can feed us exactly what we want to hear, while making us believe we're being challenged. We've developed attention spans, so fractured, that we can no longer sit with uncertainty long enough to develop genuine understanding. And here's the most chilling part. We're not just losing our individual capacity for wisdom, we're losing it collectively. Our institutions, our media, our educational systems, our very culture is being rewilded by this mass flight from depth, from nuance, from the patient work of actually thinking. But what if I told you that this crisis, this apparent triumph of stupidity over wisdom, is not accidental? What if the very forces that promise to enlighten us were designed, whether intentionally or not, to do precisely the opposite? What if we're not just witnessing the decline of human intelligence, but participating in the systematic dismantling of the very cognitive infrastructure that made civilization possible? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover might just rewire the way you see your reality, your choices, and your mind forever. What we'll explore together could change the way you understand yourself, your habits, and your future. We're about to embark on a journey into the hidden mechanisms that are stealing our capacity for wisdom, and more importantly, how to reclaim it. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and the stakes are higher than you imagine. The question isn't whether you can afford to examine this crisis. The question is whether you can afford not to. Picture yourself as an archaeologist of the mind, carefully brushing away layers of dust from a civilization that once prized wisdom above all else. What you uncover isn't pretty. Beneath the surface of our hyper-connected world lies a psychological wasteland, a place where the very mechanisms that should cultivate wisdom have been rewired to manufacture its opposite. This isn't happening by accident. There are forces at work, some intentional, others emergent, that have fundamentally altered how human consciousness operates in the 20th. To understand this transformation, we need to excavate the psychological and philosophical foundations that once supported wise thinking, and see how they've been systematically dismantled. Let's start with something Arthur Schopenhauer observed over a century ago: all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. But what happens when a society gets stuck in stage one? What happens when ridicule becomes the default response to complexity? When mockery becomes the weapon of choice against anyone who dares to think deeply? You're living in that world right now. We've created a culture where intellectual curiosity is branded as pretension, where philosophical inquiry is dismissed as navel-gazing, where the pursuit of wisdom is seen as an antiquated luxury that modern people simply don't have time for. But this isn't just cultural preference, it's psychological conditioning. Carl Jung understood something profound about human nature. We possess what he called the collective unconscious, a shared repository of human experiences, archetypes, and wisdom accumulated over millennia. But Jung also warned that this collective wisdom could be severed from conscious awareness, leaving entire populations psychologically orphaned, cut off from the very insights that could guide them through life's complexity. That severance is happening right now, and it's being facilitated by what we might call cognitive industrialization, the mass production of shallow thinking patterns that serve economic and political interests, rather than human flourish. Consider the profound shift in how we process information. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, wrote extensively about the human search for meaning. He observed that when people lose their sense of purpose, they become susceptible to what he called existential vacuum, a hollowness that makes them vulnerable to manipulation and despair. Modern society has created the perfect conditions for mass existential vacuum, by flooding us with data while starving us of meaning. Your brain wasn't designed for this. Evolutionarily, you were built to process perhaps 150 meaningful social relationships, to contemplate seasonal changes, to ponder the mysteries of fire and star. Now you're expected to have informed opinions about global politics, international economics, social movements, technological trends, environmental crises, and celebrity scandals, all while maintaining productivity in your personal and professional life. There is what psychologists call cognitive overload syndrome, a state where the mind, overwhelmed by information, shuts down its capacity for deep processing and defaults to pattern recognition based on emotional triggers, rather than rational analysis. You start thinking in memes instead of concepts, in slogans instead of principles, in reactions instead of responses. But there's something even more insidious happening. Friedrich Nietzsche predicted the rise of what he called the last man, a human being who had given up the struggle for greatness, who sought only comfort and safety, who had lost the will to overcome challenges and grow. Nietzsche wrote, "What is falling, that one should also push. Everything today falls and decays, who would preserve it? But I push it even more." We're witnessing the psychological emergence of Nietzsche's last man on a mass scale. People are choosing comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth, easy answers over difficult questions, tribal belonging over individual integrity. And this isn't happening because people are inherently lazy or stupid. It's happening because the cognitive infrastructure that supports wisdom has been systematically dismantled. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the human tendency to deny our fundamental freedom and responsibility by pretending we have no choice. In our current moment, bad faith has become institutionalized. People are taught that their opinions are determined by their identity group, that their thoughts are products of their algorithms, that their beliefs are inherited from their culture. The radical possibility that you could actually think for yourself, that you could transcend your conditioning, that you could choose wisdom over comfort, this possibility is rarely even acknowledged, let alone encouraged. This creates what we might call learned intellectual helplessness, a psychological state where people believe they're incapable of understanding complex issues, so they defer to experts, influencers, or whatever perspective feels emotionally satisfying in the moment. They become what Aldous Huxley feared in Brave New World, not people oppressed by force, but people who have learned to love their servitude. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This psychological conditioning is being reinforced by neurological changes. When you consume information in rapid fragmented bursts, scrolling through social media, jumping between news articles, multitasking between screens, you're literally rewiring your brain for superficiality. Neuroscientist Michael Merzenich has shown that our brains maintain plasticity throughout our lives, constantly reshaping themselves based on how we use them. If you use your brain primarily for rapid information consumption and immediate emotional reactions, it becomes optimized for those functions at the expense of sustained attention, deep contemplation, and complex reason. You're not just choosing to think shallowly, you're training your brain to become incapable of thinking deeply. This is why recovering wisdom isn't just a matter of choosing better information sources or developing better habits. It's about recognizing that your consciousness itself has been colonized by forces that profit from your confusion, your reactivity, your inability to see beyond the immediate surface of things. The philosopher Martin Heidegger warned about the danger of what he called das Man, the anonymous they, that shapes public opinion and social norms. When you think the thoughts of das Man, you're not really thinking at all, you're simply echoing the collective voice, participating in what we might call groupthink ventriloquism. But consciousness can be decolonized, wisdom can be recovered, the neural pathways that support deep thinking can be rebuilt, the psychological habits that enable clear seeing can be cultivated. The question is whether you're willing to do the work, to sit with the discomfort, to resist the pull of the crowd long enough to remember who you really are beneath all the conditions. Because what's coming next will show you just how high the stakes really are, not just for society but for your own soul. The costs of this wisdom deficit aren't abstract, they're intimate, personal, and devastating in ways you might not have considered. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been sleepwalking. Maybe it happens during a conversation where you catch yourself parroting opinions you've never actually examined. Maybe it's when you notice you can't remember the last book that genuinely changed your perspective. Or perhaps it's the creeping realization that your thoughts aren't really yours. They're composites of whatever media you've consumed, whatever your social circle believes, whatever feels safe to think. This is the first unseen consequence of our wisdom deficit, the gradual dissolution of authentic selfhood. You become a psychological collage, assembled from fragments of other people's thoughts, never quite cohering into something genuinely your own. And the most terrifying part, you might not even notice it's happening. Cognitive scientists have identified what they call source amnesia, the phenomenon where you remember information but forget where you learned it. In our hyper-connected age, this has evolved into something far more dangerous, self-amnesia. You lose track not just of where your ideas came from, but whether they're actually yours at all. Your inner voice becomes indistinguishable from the cultural noise surrounding you. This creates what we might call identity vertigo, a psychological state where you're no longer sure what you genuinely believe, versus what you think you're supposed to believe. You find yourself defending positions you've never really thought through, getting angry about issues you don't fully understand, feeling passionate about causes that might contradict other values you hold. The result is a kind of internal chaos masquerading as conviction. But the consequences go deeper than personal confusion. When individuals lose their capacity for authentic thought, they become vulnerable to what social psychologists call cascade effects. The phenomenon where false beliefs spread rapidly through populations, not because they're true but because they appear popular. You start believing things not because you've examined the evidence, but because everyone else seems to believe them. Consider how this plays out in your relationships. Without wisdom to guide you, you begin relating to people as categories rather than individuals. Your uncle becomes the conservative, your coworker becomes the liberal, your neighbor becomes the religious one. You stop seeing the complexity, the contradictions, the humanity that makes each person unique. Instead, you interact with your own projections, your own simplified mental models of who you think they are. This is how empathy dies, not through cruelty but through reductionism. When you lose the capacity for nuanced thinking, you lose the ability to hold space for nuanced human beings. Relationships become performative rather than authentic, strategic rather than spontaneous, ideological rather than intimate. The neurologist Antonio Damasio has shown that emotions and reasoning are not separate systems, but deeply integrated networks in the brain. When your capacity for complex reasoning atrophies, your emotional life becomes simultaneously more volatile and more shallow. You experience what we might call emotional whiplash, rapid swings between intense reactions that lack depth or staying power. This manifests as a kind of psychological brittleness,
Small disagreements feel like personal attacks. Minor setbacks feel like catastrophes. Uncertainty feels unbearable. You lose what the Stoic philosophers called emotional resilience, the ability to maintain equanimity in the face of life's inevitable challenges. But perhaps the most insidious consequence is what happens to your relationship with truth itself. When you're no longer equipped to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information, between correlation and causation, between anecdote and evidence, you begin to treat all claims as equally valid or equally suspect. This leads to what philosophers call epistemic nihilism, the belief that truth is impossible to know, so you might as well believe whatever feels good. This sounds liberating, but it's actually a form of intellectual suicide. When you abandon the pursuit of truth, you abandon the possibility of genuine wisdom, authentic growth, meaningful relationships, and purposeful action. You become what T. Eliot described as hollow men, beings who exist but don't really live, who move through the world without ever quite inhabiting it. The societal implications are staggering. When large populations lose their connection to wisdom, democratic discourse becomes impossible. Politics devolves into tribal warfare. Science becomes just another opinion. History becomes malleable. Justice becomes subjective. The shared foundations that make civilization possible begin to crumble. We're witnessing this erosion in real time. The breakdown of institutional trust, the polarization of public discourse, the rise of conspiracy thinking, the collapse of shared standards for evaluating claims about reality. These aren't separate phenomena. They're all symptoms of the same underlying disease, the mass abandonment of wisdom as a cultural value. But the personal costs might be even higher than the social ones. When you lose your capacity for wisdom, you lose your ability to learn from your mistakes. You become trapped in recurring patterns, making the same errors over and over again, because you lack the insight to recognize what's happening. Your life becomes a series of reactions rather than a coherent narrative of growth and development. You also lose what Viktor Frankl called the will to meaning, the deep human drive to find purpose and significance in existence. Without wisdom to help you discern what truly matters, you become susceptible to what he termed existential frustration, a chronic sense that life is meaningless, that your efforts don't matter, that you're just going through the motion. This existential emptiness doesn't remain contained within individuals. It spreads through cultures like a psychological contagion. Societies that lose their connection to wisdom become nihilistic, hedonistic, or both. They pursue pleasure without purpose, power without principle, progress without direction. They become what the ancient Greeks would have recognized as barbaric, not because they lack technology or sophistication, but because they lack the wisdom to use their capabilities wisely. Yet here's what makes this crisis so particularly dangerous. It's largely invisible to those experiencing it. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with low ability in a domain often overestimate their competence in that domain. When applied to wisdom, this means that the less wise you become, the more confident you feel about your understanding of complex issues. This creates a feedback loop of increasing ignorance, paired with increasing certainty, exactly the opposite of what wisdom requires. You become like a person losing their eyesight, who insists they can see perfectly well, bumping into obstacles while denying they exist. The question that should haunt you is this: how would you know if this were happening to you? How would you recognize the gradual erosion of your own capacity for wisdom? How would you detect the slow substitution of borrowed thoughts for authentic insight? The uncomfortable truth is that you might not be able to detect it from the inside. That's why the next phase of our journey is so crucial, because recognizing the problem is only the first step. What comes next is learning how to rebel against these invisible forces, how to reclaim your birthright of clear thinking, and how to rebuild the cognitive infrastructure that makes wisdom possible. Here's something they don't want you to know. Every act of genuine thinking is an act of rebellion. Every moment you pause to question rather than react, every time you choose depth over speed, every instance where you resist the pull of the crowd, you're engaging in cognitive warfare against systems designed to keep you intellectually docile. The rebellion begins with a radical realization. You are not your thoughts. You are the consciousness that observes thoughts, that can choose which ones to entertain and which ones to dismiss. This distinction between the thinker and the thoughts is the foundation of all wisdom traditions, from ancient Buddhism to modern cognitive psychology. But it's also the key to your liberation from the forces of mass stupefaction. Think of your mind as occupied territory. For years, maybe decades, foreign armies have been moving through your consciousness, setting up camps, establishing supply lines, recruiting your own mental resources to serve their purposes. These armies wear different uniforms, Some carry the banner of entertainment, others march under the flag of social media, still others disguise themselves as news, education or expert opinion. But they all share the same objective: to keep you from thinking independent. The first stage of rebellion is reconnaissance. You need to map the occupied territory, to identify which thoughts are actually yours, and which are foreign installations. This requires what the ancient Greeks called metanoia, a fundamental shift in consciousness, a turning around of the mind. You begin to watch your own thinking process, with the detached curiosity of a scientist, studying an interesting specimen. Start here. For 1 week, every time you find yourself having a strong opinion about something, pause and ask yourself 3 questions. First, where did this opinion come from? Second, what evidence do I have for this belief? Third, what would I lose if this opinion were wrong? You'll be shocked at how many of your supposedly firm convictions evaporate under this gentle scrutiny. This practice reveals something profound. Most of what you consider your thinking is actually a kind of intellectual ventriloquism. You're the dummy sitting on someone else's lap, moving your mouth while they supply the word. The rebellion begins when you recognize this dynamic and decide to reclaim your voice. But here's where it gets challenging. Genuine thinking is hard work. It requires what Daniel Kahneman called System 2 thinking: slow, effortful, deliberate cognitive process. Your brain, evolved for survival rather than truth-seeking, naturally resists this effort. It wants to default to System 1: fast, automatic, emotion-driven responses that feel certain even when they're wrong. The second stage of rebellion involves training your mind like an athlete trains their body. Just as physical fitness requires progressive resistance, intellectual fitness requires progressive complexity. You need to deliberately seek out ideas that challenge your assumptions, arguments that make you uncomfortable, perspectives that force you to think harder than you want to. This is why the great rebels of consciousness throughout history were all voracious readers, not of books that confirmed their existing beliefs, but of works that stretched their mental capabilities. Nietzsche read Schopenhauer even though he disagreed with him. Marx studied classical economics even as he sought to overturn it. Einstein immersed himself in Newton's physics even as he revolutionized it. But reading alone isn't enough. You need what we might call cognitive cross-training, deliberate practice in different modes of thinking. Study logic to sharpen your reasoning. Practice meditation to develop attention. Learn about cognitive biases to recognize your blind spots. Engage with great art to cultivate aesthetic sensitivity. Study history to develop perspective. Learn a new language to break your conceptual prison. The third stage involves building what ancient philosophers called intellectual courage, the willingness to think forbidden thoughts, to question sacred assumptions, to stand alone when necessary. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the rebellion, because it often comes at a social cost. When you start thinking independently, you become dangerous to systems that depend on conformity. Your friends might find you challenging rather than comfortable. Your family might worry that you're becoming difficult. Your colleagues might see you as less predictable, less manageable. You might find yourself invited to fewer social gatherings, included in fewer group chats, welcomed into fewer tribal circles. This is the price of cognitive freedom, and it's not trivial. Humans are social creatures, and the fear of ostracism is one of our deepest anxieties. But here's what the wisdom rebels throughout history discovered: when you stop trying to fit in everywhere, you start belonging to yourself. And that self-belonging becomes the foundation for authentic relationships with others, who value truth over comfort. The fourth stage is perhaps the most paradoxical: developing intellectual humility. True rebellion against ignorance isn't about becoming arrogant or dismissive. It's about becoming genuinely curious. The wisest rebels are those who hold their beliefs lightly, who remain open to new evidence, who can change their minds without losing their identity. Socrates modeled this perfectly. His method wasn't to proclaim the truth but to ask better questions. His rebellion wasn't against other people's ignorance, but against the illusion of knowledge itself, including his own. This is the deepest level of cognitive rebellion, the willingness to betray your own certainties in service of truth. The final stage involves what we might call wisdom evangelism, not preaching or proselytizing, but living in such a way that others begin to question their own intellectual captivity. When you embody genuine curiosity, authentic thinking, and intellectual courage, you become a living reminder of what's possible. You become what Václav Havel called the power of the powerless, someone whose very existence challenges the system, simply by demonstrating an alternative way of being. This rebellion isn't about becoming a contrarian or a conspiracy theorist. It's not about rejecting all authority, or believing nothing. It's about reclaiming your right and responsibility to think for yourself, to evaluate claims based on evidence, rather than popularity, to hold complexity rather than demanding simplicity. The rebels who succeed in this cognitive liberation report something remarkable. Life becomes more interesting, relationships become more authentic, decisions become more aligned with genuine values, and a sense of purpose emerges naturally from clarity rather than being imposed from outside. But the most profound transformation is yet to be revealed, because what we've covered so far is just preparation for the ultimate truth about wisdom, consciousness, and human potential. What comes next will show you not just how to think clearly, but why clear thinking is the key to everything that matters in life.